In just 47 seconds inside the East Room, Donald Trump exploded with fury, shouting at Barack Obama to get out. The chandeliers shook as America watched dignity and rage collide under one roof. But when Obama's calm reply cut deeper than any scream, what does it say about who truly holds power in this country? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The outburst hadn't come yet, but the room was already trembling as if history itself was holding its breath. The East Room of the White House glittered under chandeliers that felt less like celebration lights and more like floodlights before an interrogation. Polished marble reflected faces tense with expectation. Senators, governors, students, and journalists all leaning in, whispering as though they knew the night would not end quietly. Unity Night was supposed to be a pageant of cooperation, yet the silence between clinking glasses felt more like the countdown before a detonation. At the head table, Donald Trump sat rigid, his tie a slash of red against the cream backdrop, fingers drumming impatiently like a clock winding down to zero. Across from him, Barack Obama remained carved in calm stillness. Dark suit, pressed expression, unreadable, the kind of composure that unsettled more than anger ever could. Cameras drank in the contrast, returning again and again to the two men who had shaped America's last decade. The audience didn't need a program to know the headline was already in the making. The air was electric, too sharp for small talk to disguise. Every polite laugh sounded staged, every clink of silverware a little too loud, as if each noise was betraying nerves no one dared admit. Journalists typed furiously, their eyes flicking upward, waiting for the first spark. Governors leaned close to whisper, only to straighten when cameras swung their way. Students gripped their phones tighter, live stream apps open, ready to catch the instant when civility snapped. Then came the glance, the split-second collision of two stares across the hall. Trump's eyes locked on Obama's, heavy, unblinking, a silent dare. The room stilled as if even the chandeliers had braced themselves. Obama didn't blink, didn't move. His calm was louder than any outburst, and those who caught the moment knew it was the first crack in a dam too swollen to hold. The whispers fell to murmurs, the murmurs into silence. Every heart seemed to pound in rhythm with Trump's clenched jaw. Unity Night had just transformed into something else entirely, a powder keg disguised as diplomacy. And as the cameras hovered like vultures, one question rose above the hum of fear and expectation: when power and dignity sit at the same table, which speaks louder? The storm hadn't broken yet, but the room was vibrating with an energy no one could quite disguise. Plates of roast chicken and crystal glasses passed from hand to hand, laughter drifting across the tables like fragile smoke. Governors swapped stories about football. Senators chuckled over trade deals, and aides leaned close to whisper polite reassurances. On the surface, it looked like a dinner, but underneath it felt like a waiting game. Every word too sharp, every laugh too forced, every glance toward the head table, betraying what was really on their minds. Reporters typed like their keyboards were weapons eyes, darting between Trump's restless movements and Obama's stillness. Trump shifted constantly, tugging at his cuff, rearranging his fork, scanning the room as if searching for cracks in the decorum. His restlessness spread like static, infecting even the clinking of silverware with unease. Meanwhile, Obama moved with the kind of control that only magnified the tension, folding a piece of paper, neatly sipping water. Slowly, each gesture precise, deliberate, unnerving. It was the calm of a man who knew the fuse was already lit. The audience could feel it in their bones. Laughter thinned into silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the waitstaff slowed their movements, trays hovering just a second too long, as though they too knew they were carrying more than food, they were carrying history. Students leaned forward with phones poised, broadcasting fragments to millions who weren't in the room but felt as if they were. Every second stretched, every whisper seemed to crackle, louder than thunder. And then Obama rose. The scrape of his chair against the marble floor sliced through the room sharper than any shout. Applause erupted, but it wasn't unanimous. Half the room clapped warmly. The other half faltered, their hands barely meeting their eyes, darting toward Trump as if seeking permission. The division was visible, audible, undeniable. Some smiled with relief, others stiffened in dread. The cameras closed in, capturing every hesitation, every beat of sweat, every heartbeat amplified by silence. It was no longer a dinner, it was theater, a stage where one man's calm threatened another man's pride, and every person in the East Room knew the script could combust at any second. As Obama adjusted the microphone, the crowd leaned forward collectively, their breath held hostage by anticipation. And hanging over them all, like the echo of a ticking clock, was the question that no one dared speak aloud. What happens when truth enters a room built for performance? Obama's voice cut through the tension like a blade wrapped in velvet, calm, steady, unhurried. Our strength, he began, his tone, measured but resonant, has never come from how loudly we shout, but from how bravely we choose unity over division. His words echoed against the gilded walls, each syllable landing heavier than the chandeliers above their heads. The room leaned in, transfixed, caught between reverence and dread, as if they were watching a tightrope walker step out over an abyss with no net. Trump shifted in his chair, fingers drumming harder. Now the rhythm no longer patient, but hostile. His shoulders twitched, his jaw locked, his lips pressed so thin they seemed to vanish. Every camera caught it, every eye registered it. The sitting president of the United States visibly seething, his fury swelling in real time. But Obama kept going, never raising his voice, never glancing down, speaking not to the man glaring at him, but to the nation that waited beyond the walls. This nation, he said, his cadence deliberate, the pause before his next words stretching like a drawn bow, is bigger than one man's pride. The line detonated across the East Room. Gasps rose from the tables, sharp intakes of breath, like the crowd had been struck all at once. A senator covered her mouth, a student whispered, "Oh my God," and aides shifted in their seats as though trying to vanish. Awe, unease, even fear rippled outward in concentric circles, leaving the room trembling on the edge of silence. Trump could not contain himself. He lurched forward, red-faced, his voice cracking like thunder as he roared, "Get out." The words slammed into the marble and bounced back louder than the chandelier's glitter, harsher than the camera's clicks. For an instant, it felt like the entire East Room had collapsed into that one command, the raw fury of a man who believed volume could bury truth. People flinched in their chairs, forks froze, midair glasses hovered untouched. A president had just ordered a former president out of the White House. The air cracked with the weight of it, disbelief mingling with fear. The East Room transformed into an arena where rage and dignity collided under blinding lights. Obama did not move. He stood still, unbroken, his expression carved from stone, his silence louder than Trump's shout. The tension was unbearable, the kind that bends a room into stillness, the kind that makes time itself hesitate. And in that silence, one question hung heavy over every beating heart: can dignity survive when fury commands the stage? "Get out" still hung in the East Room like smoke after an explosion, its echo ricocheting off marble and gilt. Guests recoiled, crystal chimed to nervous music. Aides half rose, papers slid. Whispers collided into panic. Cameras punched in tight red tally lights, glaring like sirens. Obama did not move. He neither blinked nor reached for his notes. His hands stayed loosely folded, a refusal to feed the fire. The stillness thickened, stretching seconds into wire pulled tight enough to sing. People felt it in their ribs, the hush that arrives when a room knows it has crossed a line it cannot uncross. Trump's breath came in ragged bursts, the microphones caught and magnified a harsh metronome to words he could not find. His fingers drummed, then clawed the linen as if noise could rip a hole in silence. A vein throbbed at his temple, anger with nowhere to land. The more he stirred, the stiller the other man became, and the contrast made the air volatile. Normal life shattered around them. A student filming whispered, "Oh my God." A waiter froze mid-step, a tray, trembling each glass a tiny earthquake. Even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate, flinging shards of light like shrapnel. The atmosphere felt weaponized, charged, waiting for a wrong breath to set it off. Seconds stacked into something heavier than time. Silence stopped being absence and became a weight across collarbones and clenched teeth. Reporters trained to fill gaps with words stared through viewfinders, knowing speech might break the spell. The East Room breathed as one organism suspended between detonation and deliverance. Unity night had vanished. Only a stage remained where two definitions of power faced each other. Trump's chair scraped a fraction metal-biting marble. People flinched again. He leaned forward, lips curling, ready to flood the vacuum with volume. but the vacuum no longer answered to him. It belonged to the man who hadn't moved. Obama lifted his chin a fraction, not defiance, but possession of ground already shifted. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, it was exact. The words moved cleanly, a blade sliding through cloth. If unity makes you this uncomfortable. He let the line hang ring register. Maybe it says more about where we are as a country than anything I could say tonight. A low, involuntary sound rolled through the room, half exhale, half shock. Shoulders dropped at the staff tables. At the student tables, thumbs flew. Captions bloomed, the sentence already escaping the walls. A senator looked down and noticed her hands were shaking. Trump's mouth opened and closed, words caught behind heat and pride. The command he had hurled moments earlier felt weightless now, exposed by a reply that refused its frequency and buried it beneath composure. Obama's restraint didn't just absorb the blow, it redirected it like water finding the flaw in stone. The room that moments ago obeyed authority now obeyed gravity. Quiet pooled toward the podium, as if allegiance had shifted without permission. For a suspended instant, only the lesson existed. Composure can drown fury and volume cannot manufacture respect. Phones recorded, eyes watered. Across the country, screens brightened as people leaned closer, sensing a hinge in the story. And as the silence returned, sharper than glass, twice as dangerous, one question hovered like a blade at the throat of power. Is silence sometimes the sharpest weapon? For a long moment after Obama's words, the silence held like a glass dome over the East Room. Then from somewhere near the back, a whisper slipped free. Wow. It wasn't loud, but it carried like the first crack in a sheet of ice. Heads turned, senators exchanged uneasy looks, their eyes flickering between Trump's rigid frame and Obama's calm stance. The spell of stillness began to fracture, and with it came the first tremors of something larger. Applause began hesitantly, a single pair of hands clapping from the left side of the room. The sound rang out awkwardly, uncertain whether it was courage or mistake. Then another set joined, and another, the rhythm growing steadier, until the hesitation was drowned in a ripple of conviction. The marble floor seemed to reverberate with each new beat, and soon the hall was vibrating with energy that no one had expected. The audience, once frozen in fear, was shifting like a tide turning against the moon. Students on the side benches lifted their phones higher, their screens glowing like tiny spotlights aimed at the podium. Live captions appeared in real time, flooding social media with Obama's words, and within seconds the feeds were exploding comments, scrolling faster than eyes could follow. The chants and applause in the East Room were no longer contained. They were echoing outward into millions of living rooms and dormitories across America. The battle for the narrative had left the chandeliers and gold drapery. It now surged through the veins of the internet. Trump shifted in his chair, jaw tight, watching the crowd slip from his grasp. His fists clenched, but the applause only grew louder, sharper, more defiant. Each clap was no longer just approval, it was resistance. Even senators from his own party avoided his eyes, their unease laid bare in every nervous twitch. The East Room was no longer his stage. The people inside it were writing a new script with their voices in their hands. Then it happened, a single voice, clear and steady, rising above the applause, let him speak. The words sliced through the noise, startling in their boldness. For a moment it stood alone, trembling in the open air. But then another voice echoed it, and another, until the phrase multiplied, swelling into a chant that wrapped around the room. Let him speak. Let him speak. The sound grew until it was impossible to ignore, a tidal wave crashing against the authority of the most powerful office in the world. Obama remained still, letting the voices build around him like a shield. Trump's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening, but swallowed by the chant that refused to die. The crowd had found its rhythm, its courage, its unity, and for the first time that night, the balance of power had shifted from the podium to the people themselves. And as the chant rolled on, louder than chandeliers, sharper than marble, one question thundered beneath it all. Can the voice of the people overpower the command of a president? The chant thundered against the gilded walls, pounding louder with each repetition. Let him speak. Let him speak. Trump's face twisted crimson, his body jerking with the fury of a man who felt control slipping through his fingers. He shoved back his chair with a screech of wood against marble, and began pacing each step sharp and angry, like a soldier on broken ground. His voice cracked as he shouted over the crowd, "You're humiliating me in my own house. This is disgraceful." The words rattled the chandeliers, but they no longer commanded the room. He slammed his palm onto the table, the silverware clattering like shrapnel scattering across linen. The force made aides flinch their eyes, darting toward the Secret Service, posted at the edges of the room. "Security, get him out of here." Trump barked, his finger stabbing the air toward Obama, but the agents didn't move. They stood motionless, stone-faced eyes scanning, but bodies still statues, carved from protocol and quiet defiance. The silence of their inaction was deafening. It spoke louder than Trump's roar. The room felt like it had tipped into chaos, yet within the chaos, a strange order was emerging. Guests exchanged nervous glances, some biting their lips, others clutching the edges of their seats. Senators leaned forward, caught between shock and calculation, while students lifted their phones higher, capturing history as it unfolded in real time. The President of the United States was shouting, demanding obedience, but obedience refused to come. The spell of his authority was unraveling thread by thread. Trump's pacing grew erratic. He muttered curses under his breath, hands gesturing wildly, sweat shining under the hot lights. Every second his commands went unanswered, the image of his power shrank. The Secret Service agents didn't even glance at one another. Their stillness betrayed a decision already made. They would not drag a former president from the room. They would not light the fuse on political suicide. And in their refusal, they revealed something: raw power without respect is hollow. Across the hall, Obama remained still. He hadn't moved since the eruption began, his posture calm, his presence unshaken. He radiated composure, not with force, but with something sharper: patience, confidence, dignity. The cameras caught the contrast with brutal clarity, one man pacing and raging, the other standing like stone. Every lens framed it the same way, and the audience outside the walls would see it replay. It'd feel it. The contrast had become the story. The chant began to fade, not from fear but from completion, replaced by a silence heavier than before. Trump's shouts rang emptier, now echoes of a command no longer recognized. The air held its breath again, but this time the room wasn't waiting for him. It was waiting for the man who hadn't moved. And in that breath, the question settled like a verdict written in marble. What defines leadership: authority demanded or respect earned? The East Room quivered under the weight of chaos, Trump pacing and fuming, his shouts ricocheting uselessly off walls lined with gold. Then, without raising his voice, Obama leaned into the microphone, his posture still unshaken, his tone steady as steel wrapped in velvet. "We are standing in the people's house," he said, pausing long enough for every eye to lock on him, "not one man's stage." The words cracked through the tension like a lightning strike, sharp, undeniable, and instantly unforgettable. Gasps rippled across the room. Some guests pressed hands to their mouths. Others let out audible exhales as if the sentence had yanked the air from their lungs. The silence that followed lasted only a beat before it broke apart, first in scattered claps, tentative, uncertain, as though testing the boundaries of defiance. Then the applause swelled louder, faster, rolling through the chamber like a gathering storm. The crowd had been waiting for permission, and in those 9 words, Obama had handed it to them. Trump froze mid-pace, his body rigid, his face reddening with disbelief as the sound engulfed him. The applause wasn't polite, it was powerful, charged, electric. Senators who had hesitated before now joined in clapping with a force that betrayed something more than courtesy. Students shot up from their benches, their phones raised high, streaming the moment into millions of homes. Screens across America lit up with hashtags, "Let him speak, calm thunder." What had begun as whispers of resistance was now trending in real time, an avalanche that could not be stopped. The ovation climbed higher, shifting into a standing wave of energy. Guests rose to their feet, some pounding their hands together until their palms burned, others whistling, shouting their approval above the roar. The gold-draped chamber shook not with rage but with release, a collective catharsis that had been building through every second of silence, every crack in Trump's authority. The East Room, long the backdrop for state dinners and ceremonies, now felt like an arena, every voice aligned against the illusion of power that had tried to smother them. Obama did not smile, did not gloat. He simply stood there absorbing the ovation without bending beneath it, his expression steady as if reminding the room that this moment wasn't about him, it was about them. And that realization hit hard. The power had shifted. No longer Trump's stage, no longer a president's theater. The East Room belonged to the people inside it, to the millions watching beyond its doors, to the voices that refused to be silenced. The cameras drank it all, and the man raging in the corner, and the man who hadn't moved framed against a crowd that had chosen its side. The applause rolled on relentless, echoing off marble, until it felt like the very building was vibrating with defiance. Hashtags surged by the second commentary flooded every feed, and in living rooms across the country, Americans sat forward, some with tears, others with clenched fists, knowing they were watching something larger than politics unfold. This was not a victory measured in volume, but in resonance. And as the ovation roared like thunder against the rafters, one question settled deep into the hearts of everyone present and everyone watching: who truly owns democracy, leaders or the people watching? The ovation in the East Room thundered into the night, but its echo did not stop at the White House walls. Screens across the country lit up in an instant, living rooms in Ohio, dorm halls in California, diners in Georgia, where coffee cups paused midair. Families leaned forward, their eyes wide, the glow of televisions and phones painting their faces in blue light. America wasn't just watching a political event, it was watching a collision of rage and dignity unfold in real time. In a cramped apartment in Chicago, a retired civil rights leader shook his head, slowly, eyes glistening, as he whispered, "I've seen presidents shout before, but never dignity answer rage this way." His voice cracked, and those gathered around him fell silent, knowing they were hearing the weight of history distilled into a single sentence. In Phoenix, college students crowded into a dorm lounge, phones held high as they shouted at the screen, their cheers matching the roar of applause they heard from Washington. In a diner in rural Kansas, truckers and farmers muttered among themselves, torn between loyalty to a president and the undeniable power of the moment playing before their eyes. The reactions spanned the spectrum: empathy, inspiration, disbelief, even anger. Some viewers felt a jolt of pride that dignity had stood unbroken under the harshest fire. Others felt unease, as though a mirror had been shoved in front of a nation that could no longer pretend volume was strength. But no one felt nothing. Across union halls, kitchen tables, subway cars, the confrontation was replayed, dissected, absorbed. It had become more than a clash of men. It was a lesson televised to millions. Social media erupted like a dam bursting. Clips flooded timelines in endless loops. Trump pacing fists clenched, his voice cracking with rage. Then split-screened against him, Obama standing still, sipping from a glass of water with unshakable calm. Memes bloomed within minutes, captions reading "Rage versus restraint, thunder versus stone." Hashtags soared to the top of every platform. Hashtag "Let him speak." Hashtag "Calm thunder." Hashtag "People's House." The digital battlefield no longer belonged to Trump's words. It belonged to the contrast the cameras had made immortal. In Brooklyn, teenagers replayed the clip again and again, their laughter at Trump's rage giving way to awe at Obama's restraint. In Atlanta, a church group gathered around a projector, nodding solemnly as the silence in the clip replayed each pause, carrying the weight of a sermon. In Los Angeles, comedians scrambled to weave the footage into their routines, knowing the image of two men, one shouting, one still, was more powerful than any punchline they could write. The country felt suspended, united not in agreement, but in focus. Millions watched, argued, posted, but all circled back to the same undeniable image: a man's fury unraveling against another man's composure. The East Room had birthed not just a political moment, but a national mirror, one that every household, diner, classroom, and phone screen was now forced to stare into. And as the memes multiplied and hashtags climbed, one haunting question pulsed through the digital tide. Impossible to scroll past. Does truth carry more power in the digital age? Or does volume still win? The roar of hashtags and applause seemed to rattle the very air, and Trump could take no more. He slammed his palm onto the table's silverware, scattering like shrapnel, and bellowed, "This is over." His voice cracked, a jagged sound amplified by desperation rather than strength. He jabbed a finger toward the podium, shouting, "Clear it now. Remove him." The order tore through the chamber like a whip, but the room did not move. The Secret Service agents stood still silent, sentinels at the edges of the chaos. Their faces remained impassive, their bodies locked in refusal as if carved into the marble itself. They did not step forward, did not so much as shift their stance. The weight of their inaction fell heavier than any weapon. It was the sound of a command ignored, of authority eroding in real time. For the first time that night, it wasn't Obama who looked isolated. It was the president. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Trump's voice rose, higher veins straining against his temples, words spiraling into incoherence. "Do your job. Get him out of here," he barked again, his face a mask of fury. But his demands hit the walls and fell flat. No echo, no compliance, only silence, pressing harder with every passing second. His own aides shrank back, eyes wide, caught between loyalty and survival. The East Room, once his stage, was now a mirror, showing him his impotence. And then Obama's voice cut through calm and final landing, like a gavel on stone. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." The words rippled outward, simple yet seismic, a verdict disguised as a statement. The crowd erupted, not with scattered applause this time, but with thunder and ovations so fierce the marble trembled beneath it. People rose from their seats, clapping, shouting, cheering, their voices merging into a single tidal wave of defiance. Even some Republicans shifted uneasily, their hands hesitant, but their eyes betraying the truth they could no longer deny. The cameras caught everything. One man, red-faced fists, balled his commands, dissolving into the void, and another standing steady, shoulders squared, radiating composure. Rage against dignity, chaos against calm. The contrast had never been clearer, never more brutal. Trump had tried to end the night with force, but instead it ended with him silenced, not by power, not by policy, but by the sheer absence of respect. The applause rolled on, unstoppable, relentless, drowning his shouts and filling the hall with something that felt bigger than politics. It was judgment, raw and unfiltered, passed not by courts or ballots, but by the collective will of those who refused to bow to noise. And as the ovation surged like thunder crashing against marble, one question lingered in every corner of the East Room, and every home across America: can respect once lost ever be regained? The thunderous ovation in the East Room hadn't even faded before the first networks cut into live programming. CNN's Chyron flashed in red, bold letters searing across the screens. Nationwide, Trump shouts, "Get out." Obama's calm reply stuns. Anchors leaned forward, their voices tight with urgency, as they replayed the clip again and again, each time slowing down the contrast. Trump's red-faced fists hammering the table cut against Obama's stillness, his quiet words carrying like a drumbeat. It wasn't just news, it was spectacle. Fox News broke in seconds later, their panel split like a fault line under stress. Some commentators scrambled to defend Trump, insisting a president had the right to demand silence on a stage. But others' faces, pale eyes flicking nervously toward the footage. Looping in the corner looked visibly shaken. They hesitated, tripped over words, caught in the impossible task of spinning rage into strength. For once, the rehearsed lines felt brittle, shattering under the weight of the unedited footage. MSNBC poured gasoline on the fire, running the clip on repeat until it became less a video and more a ritual. Obama's calm delivery, his voice quiet but resonant. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned," played every 5 minutes, each airing gathering fresh momentum. Viewers didn't just watch, they memorized. They mouthed the line with him, some whispering it under their breath, others shouting it into the silence of their living rooms. By midnight, the confrontation had hijacked the national conversation. News tickers across every network screamed variations of the same headline: rage versus restraint. Talk radio lit up with callers, some furious, others exhilarated, but all unable to look away. Hashtags dominated the digital landscape. Hashtag respect earned. Hashtag volume this character. Hashtag let him speak. The nation wasn't arguing whether it had been dramatic. It was arguing what it meant. The clash had leapt beyond politics. It had become a morality play. In Philadelphia, bar patrons stood shoulder to shoulder, beers in hand, replaying the clip on muted TVs and shaking their heads in disbelief. In Miami, retirees gathered around kitchen tables, voices rising, some defending Trump's authority, while others asked aloud if authority meant anything without respect. In Portland, students filled coffee shops, their laptops streaming MSNBC's looping footage, their conversations turning the night into a study session on leadership, truth, and power. The footage, unpolished and raw, moved faster than commentary could contain. Memes erupted, Trump pounding the table split against Obama, calmly sipping water. One caption read, "Noise versus nerve," another simply, "Character wins." The internet, merciless in its appetite, had seized the contrast and burned it into the collective consciousness. And then came the moment of crystallization. Across platforms, across networks, one line stood above the rest, clipped from the chaos and carried like a banner through the night. Leadership isn't measured by volume, but by character. It wasn't just a quote. It was a verdict stamped and replayed until it became impossible to deny. The words that had silenced the East Room now roared across a nation. By dawn, America wasn't just watching a scandal. It was living inside a story that refused to be spun. And as the footage played on, Loop One question began to harden in every living room, diner, newsroom, and phone screen. In a world of spin, can raw footage rewrite the narrative? The clip had already flooded the airwaves, but by the following evening, it mutated into something new: entertainment. On late-night television, the moment replayed not as breaking news but as comedy, and the audience laughed with the release of people who had been holding their breath for 24 hours. One host leaned forward, imitating Trump's table slam, shouting, "Get out," before cutting to a clip of Obama sipping water, stone-faced to thunderous applause from the studio. Another cracked, "Who knew the loudest mic drop in history didn't even need a mic drop?" The crowd roared, half in amusement, half in awe, knowing they were laughing at more than a joke. They were laughing at a president's unraveling. Saturday Night Live wasted no time. Its cold open was a perfect parody. An actor in a red tie, pacing face painted beet red veins, exaggerated shouting, "This is my house," while another dressed as Obama stood still, calmly sipping from a water glass as the audience howled. The skit ended with the Obama impersonator turning to the camera, repeating in a perfect cadence, "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." The line, delivered in jest, drew not laughter, but a standing ovation, blurring the line between satire and solemnity. Outside, the studio's culture itself seized the moment. College students in Chicago unfurled a massive projector screen in the middle of campus, replaying the confrontation on loop under the night sky. Hundreds gathered, chanting, "Let him speak," as if rehearsing history. They launched a campaign called Dignity First, selling t-shirts with Obama's quote, handing out flyers stamped with hashtags, turning a single sentence into a grassroots brand. What had been a political flashpoint was becoming a cultural movement. In Los Angeles, TikTok creators layered dramatic music over the clip cutting, between Trump's rage and Obama's composure, splicing captions that read, "Rage versus dignity and noise versus nerve." The audios went viral, users lip-syncing Obama's calm reply, as though it were the chorus of a song. In Brooklyn, murals appeared overnight, Obama's silhouette rendered in black and white, his words painted in bold crimson letters across brick walls. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." Passers-by stopped, photographed, posted, and the quote spread again, carried not by news anchors, but by artists. Even the pulpits echoed. In a church in Atlanta, a pastor paused mid-sermon, raised a finger, and intoned, "Leadership isn't measured by volume, but by character." The congregation erupted not in applause, but in solemn amens, the words lifted from politics into scripture. In classrooms, teachers wrote the quote on whiteboards, asking students to debate it. In union halls, workers invoked it to demand dignity from bosses. The line had escaped its origin and entered daily language. It was no longer Obama's, it was everyone's. By week's end, the moment no longer belonged to Washington. It belonged to the culture at large, a shared folklore retold through laughter, parody, music, paint, and prayer. It no longer mattered whether you watched it live or in a meme. Everyone knew the contrast: one man, red-faced, shouting, and another, steady, unbroken, dignified. That contrast had become shorthand, a story America would tell itself in ways words could barely contain. And as the chant of parody, the beat of memes, and the echo of sermons fused into something permanent, one question lingered over the noise and the laughter alike: when politics becomes folklore, what truth survives? By morning, the confrontation was no longer just a clip or a meme. It was numbers flashing across screens, Overnight polling showed independents swinging sharply their approval for Trump collapsing, while confidence in Obama's words surged. Chyrons blazed with headlines like "Independents Break for Obama," "After Clash and Rage versus Dignity Resonates Beyond Party Lines." For the first time in years, a single night had shifted the tectonic plates of public opinion. Inside GOP war rooms, the atmosphere was suffocating. Strategists barked into phones, demanded fresh talking points, their faces pale in the glow of laptops, streaming endless replays of Trump's outburst. Some scribbled desperate notes, spin as strength, frame as passion, but even their own voices cracked with doubt. They knew what the cameras had captured couldn't be spun away rage, looking smaller against restraint. The room smelled of burnt coffee and panic, the sound of silence punctuated only by curses when fresh poll numbers landed in inboxes. Across town, Democrats seized momentum with the precision of generals spotting weakness in retreat. Their offices buzzed with energy volunteers huddled around screens, cheering each new viral edit strategist, already crafting ads that placed Obama's calm words in stark contrast to Trump's fury. Leadership isn't measured by volume, but by character, one aide repeated, smiling like he already knew it would headline campaign billboards. The mood was electric pride mixing with hunger, a sense that history had handed them a weapon too sharp to ignore. But the shift wasn't confined to the halls of power. In diners, barbershops, and union halls, ordinary Americans were talking. A factory worker in Michigan admitted on local radio, "I voted for Trump my whole life, but..." Obama looked in control. Trump looked desperate. In a Florida retirement community, lifelong conservatives debated in hushed tones, uncomfortable with what they'd seen, but unable to deny the image seared into their minds. The truth was simple. A picture of strength and a picture of collapse had been broadcast side by side, and no amount of loyalty could erase the contrast. Social media amplified the unease. Threads lit up with confessions from voters who had never posted politics before. One viral comment read, "I didn't agree with Obama's policies, but last night I saw a leader. I saw Trump lose control." Screenshots spread like wildfire, carried into digital spaces, usually immune to political shifts. Each share, each like was another crack, widening in the narrative Trump's team had tried to control. The climax arrived in the evening, when national outlets released consolidated data approval ratings, shifting in a single day a movement not seen since 9/11 or the 2008 crash. Commentators called it the moment the country blinked. Trump's allies shouted louder, but their words felt hollow, drowned out by the raw footage looping endlessly across platforms. For the first time, the aura of invincibility around his persona seemed broken, and the nation felt the fracture ripple outward. And as the headlines blared and living rooms buzzed, a haunting question rose above the numbers, above the spin, above the panic itself. Can one sentence change the course of history? The polls had spoken, but the country was not unified. It was splitting at the seams. In Iowa, diners, farmers slammed their coffee mugs against chipped counters, voices rising as they replayed the clip on grainy TV screens. "He humiliated our president," one man barked, shaking his head with fury, while others muttered darkly about betrayal. Yet beneath the anger, a few sat quieter, staring longer at the footage, unsettled by what they had seen, but unwilling to admit it aloud. In New York, the scene was the opposite. Students poured into rallies, their chants echoing against brick buildings, replaying Obama's calm words on giant screens hung between dorm halls. They raised signs that read, "Respect is earned in dignity." First, their voices swelling into an anthem of defiance. For them, the moment was not about parties or policies. It was about a principle they felt had been proven before their eyes. Across the Midwest, the polarization sharpened like a blade. In church basements, neighbors argued over potluck tables, voices cracking with passion, plates of pie abandoned mid-bite. At workplaces, whispers turned to debates and debates to shouts as colleagues confronted one another with raw conviction. But somewhere between rage and celebration, a quieter shift stirred. Some independents, people who had sworn they were done with politics, admitted privately that they were thinking again. The power of Obama's words slipped beyond rallies and war rooms, finding their way into unexpected spaces. Teachers wrote, "Leadership is character, not volume," across chalkboards, asking students what it meant. Pastors wove the line into sermons their congregations nodding solemnly in pews. Even managers in offices repeated the quote during Monday meetings, using it as a compass for authority. A sentence once delivered under blinding chandeliers was now echoing through classrooms, workplaces, and churches, woven into the daily fabric of American life. And as the nation watched itself fracture, one question lingered, like a fault line running beneath every conversation. Do we grow stronger from conflict or more divided? Behind the towering white pillars, the East Room's roar had faded, but the storm inside the West Wing only intensified. Trump stalked the carpeted corridors like a caged animal, his shouts reverberating off the walls, aides trailing behind him, with lowered heads and trembling notepads. He slammed doors, cursed the press, and demanded to know why the networks had turned his fury into a spectacle. Every portrait in the hallway seemed to glare back at him, silent witnesses to a power unraveling from within. In the Situation Room, aides clustered around glowing screens, the infamous clip playing on loop no matter how many times they tried to click away. Trump's voice, cracking furious, was already stitched into memes paired against Obama's calm silence. One aide muttered, "It looks worse every time I see it," only to fall silent as the president stormed past the door. The air smelled of burnt coffee and panic, the weight of a narrative they could not control pressing down like a vice. Communication staff worked frantically, scribbling possible talking points on whiteboards frame as passion. Call it strength. Say Obama disrespected office. But the words died as soon as they were spoken. Each suggestion felt brittle hollow, collapsing under the raw footage playing just feet away. One advisor finally whispered what the others feared. "We can't outspin this." The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst. The chaos bled into every office. Phones rang nonstop, Republican lawmakers demanding strategy, donors demanding answers, media allies begging for direction. No one had any. One aide tried to draft a statement, her fingers shaking on the keyboard, but every sentence she typed read like surrender. Another tossed a folder onto the desk, muttering, "It doesn't matter." The video is the story. The corridors buzzed with frantic footsteps, staff darting between rooms, trying to contain a fire that had already consumed the building. And then came the leak. A memo written in desperation and circulated internally spilled into the press before dawn. The line was simple, devastating, and undeniable. "We can't defend the clip. It's brutal." Within minutes, it was everywhere on cable chyrons, across social feeds, on the front pages of early editions. The West Wing, designed to project strength, had accidentally published its own obituary of control. Trump's rage only grew as the memo spread, his shouts rattling the plaster, his aides shrinking deeper into corners. The building felt less like the center of power and more like a bunker under siege. Every television in every room glared with the same image: Trump pounding the table, Obama standing calm. The contrast was a wound that refused to close, reopening with every replay. And as panic spread through the corridors of power, one question haunted every aide, every strategist, every ally now staring at the footage they could not bury. What happens when even allies can't spin the truth? Outside the barricaded walls of Washington, the confrontation refused to die. It seeped into living rooms, classrooms, and whispered conversations across the nation. In a quiet office on Capitol Hill, a junior staffer scrolled the clip for the 10th time, her heart racing faster with each replay. She set her phone down, looked at her reflection in the darkened window, and whispered to herself, "I came here for politics, but stayed for purpose." For the first time, her work no longer felt like spin, it felt like service. In Kansas, a father gathered his children around the dinner table, the glow of a small television flickering in the corner. Forks paused as he spoke, his voice steady but weighted. "History remembers truth, not shouting," he told them, pointing at the screen where Trump raged and Obama stood unmoved. His kids, too young to know the intricacies of politics, nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson not as news, but as a compass for life. The room fell quiet, not in fear, but in reverence for something bigger than themselves. Across the country, the same moment etched itself into different lives in different ways. A teacher in Oregon paused her lesson to replay the clip for her students, writing Obama's words across the chalkboard. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." The class fell into silence, the weight of the phrase heavier than any textbook line. In Atlanta, a pastor folded the same words into his Sunday sermon, his voice trembling as his congregation murmured, "Amen," in unison. For them, the clash had crossed the boundary of politics. It had become scripture. In Detroit, factory workers crowded around a break room television, grease-stained hands folded in stillness as they watched the split screen of rage and restraint. One muttered under his breath, "That's leadership," while another stared silently, his expression betraying a conflict he hadn't admitted aloud. In Brooklyn, students painted murals of Obama's silhouette, the words stamped boldly in crimson across brick walls. Leadership isn't measured by volume, but by character. Their brushes dripped with urgency, their laughter laced with awe, knowing they were painting more than art, they were painting memory. The ripple extended even further, weaving into family arguments, workplace meetings, and private doubts. A mother in Texas told her teenage daughter during a late-night drive, "Power is nothing if people don't respect you." In Seattle, two old friends who hadn't spoken in years reconnected after sharing the same clip online, realizing they were still bound by a shared hunger for dignity and leadership. These were not grand speeches or sweeping policies. They were ordinary lives quietly redirected by one extraordinary night. By the week's end, the clash was no longer just a political moment. It had become a moral compass, a reference point individuals reached for in their own struggles, their own conflicts, their own search for truth. It was a reminder whispered at dinner tables, shouted in classrooms, painted on walls, and folded into prayers. And as the footage replayed in homes from Kansas to California, one question lingered like a refrain. How does one night in Washington ripple into everyday homes? The clash had left Washington shaken, but its true power was revealed in the weeks that followed, far from the marble halls of power. In classrooms across the nation, professors dimmed the lights, pulled up the clip, and pressed play. Students leaned forward in silence, watching the split screen of fury and composure, their notebooks filling, not with theories, but with history alive before their eyes. One professor closed his laptop slowly and said, "This is leadership distilled. Watch carefully, because moments like these shape nations." Civil rights leaders saw echoes of battles long fought. In community centers and church halls, they played the clip alongside grainy footage of marches, sit-ins, and fiery speeches that once defined another generation's struggle. They spoke of dignity as weapon of silence, as defiance of calm, as revolution. "What you saw," one elder leader said, "is not new. It is the same truth that carried us through Selma and Montgomery. Rage always thinks it wins, but history writes down the patient." The room nodded, some with tears in their eyes, feeling the thread of struggle stitched across time. High school teachers scrawled Obama's words across whiteboards, circling them in red. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." Discussions erupted as students debated what it meant for their own generation, their own futures. Some compared it to coaches, others to parents, a few to bosses at their after-school jobs. For them, the quote wasn't lofty, it was tangible, a compass they could carry in their daily lives. The moment had shifted from politics into pedagogy. In law schools, the phrase leadership isn't measured by volume, but by character was dissected like a case study. Professors asked whether restraint could be more powerful than force in governance, and whether truth could survive in the age of spin. Students argued passionately, their voices rising, but all returned to the same image, one man shouting, the other standing still. That image burned into their collective memory, became the foundation of essays, lectures, and debates already shaping the leaders they would become. Then came the crystallization. Publishers, sensing the permanence of the moment, began weaving the quote into textbooks. Chapters on modern American politics ended with a single phrase etched into bold print: "History remembers who told the truth." It was a line destined to outlive the men who spoke and raged that night, a sentence that would appear in test questions, classroom discussions, and the minds of students for decades to come. A single moment of dignity had become a written legacy. The continuity of history pulsed through every space. The clip touched bridges between past struggles and future leaders, between living memory and recorded fact. What had begun as a clash in one gilded room was now threaded into the very curriculum of a nation. And as students underlined the phrase in their books, as pastors preached it, as parents repeated it at dinner tables, one question remained heavy and unshakable. What truths will our children inherit from us? The clip no longer belonged to politics, it had been claimed by the people. In churches across the South, pastors wheeled out projectors, replaying the moment when rage collided with restraint. Congregations sat rapt, the sound of Obama's calm words echoing through wooden rafters like scripture. Heads bowed not in silence of fear, but in reverence. The lesson clear dignity itself could be a form of resistance. Union halls in Detroit and Pittsburgh turned break rooms into theaters, workers leaning forward on folding chairs, steel-toed boots tapping against linoleum. They saw in Obama's composure a reflection of their own battle strikes, where silence on the picket line spoke louder than shouts, meetings where calm endurance bent power without breaking. That's what strength looks like, one machinist muttered, drawing nods from men and women who had lived their lives balancing pride and survival. The room erupted into applause, not for a politician, but for a principle. Civic groups took up the mantle, streaming the clip in libraries, town halls, even parking lots. Students, veterans, and retirees alike gathered under flickering lights to watch it discuss, argue, and finally agree on one thing. The image of one man standing still against another's rage was more than political theater. It was a parable. People left those gatherings carrying the phrase like a seed, planting it in conversations at dinner tables, workplaces, and classrooms. The moment had become memory, and the memory was becoming collective. The emotional weight of it spread like ripples across a lake. Where once silence had been feared, mistaken for weakness, submission, or defeat, it was now rebranded as power. In communities that had long been silenced, the clip became proof that restraint could disarm fury, that calm could wound arrogance more deeply than shouting ever could. Silence was no longer absence. It was presence sharpened and intentional, a tool wielded by those who refused to be dragged into noise. The climax of this transformation was visible in every corner of the country. In small churches where choirs sang beneath stained glass, in union halls, where calloused hands clapped in unison, in civic groups that once bickered but now found unity in a single image. The clip had left the White House and entered the bloodstream of a nation teaching dignity, not as a luxury, but as a form of survival, a weapon forged from restraint. And as communities replayed the footage again and again, each time more convinced that the lesson belonged to them, one question rose above the applause, the prayers, the chants, and the quiet tears in your own life. When have you chosen silence or dignity over rage? The confrontation had long left Washington, but its resonance refused to fade. In homes across the country, parents replayed the clip for their children, not as politics, but as parable. One mother in Colorado muted the television afterward and told her son, "You don't win arguments by being the loudest. You win by being steady." A father in Kansas echoed the same over dinner, reminding his daughters that history remembers truth, not shouting. These weren't debates anymore, they were lessons stitched into family life. Workplaces, too, carried the ripple. In an office in Chicago, a manager facing a heated dispute between employees paused. The meeting pulled up the clip and let silence do its work. The tension broke not through threats, but through recognition. People saw in Obama's composure the kind of authority they wanted from each other. In union halls, machinists referenced the moment as a symbol of collective dignity, reminding one another that restraint was not weakness, but strength. The footage had become a shared vocabulary, a shorthand for how to hold ground without rage. Classrooms became laboratories for the lesson. Teachers scribbled across whiteboards. Leadership isn't measured by volume, but by character. Students debated the phrase, some citing sports coaches, others pointing to family conflicts or community leaders. In debate clubs, the clip was played as a case study. One side dissected Trump's volume, the other dissected Obama's restraint. The conclusion was rarely unanimous, but the process mattered. The younger generation was being taught to measure leadership, not by decibels, but by dignity. The emotional beat was unmistakable. Hope and resilience threaded themselves through conversations once soured by division. Communities scarred by conflict found themselves returning to the clip not as a weapon but as a balm. If he could stay calm under that fire, one grandmother in Detroit told her church group, then so can we. The footage, once just another political spectacle, had transformed into a moral touchstone. It reminded people that dignity wasn't abstract, it was practical, usable, and necessary. The climax was undeniable. The moment had grown larger than either Obama or Trump. It was no longer about a clash between two men under chandeliers. It was about a nation rediscovering the power of character itself. Posters, sermons, classroom walls, and dinner table conversations all echoed the same lesson that leadership isn't theatrics, but steadiness. Not volume, but vision. The confrontation had been political, but its legacy was profoundly human. And as the movement swelled beyond politics into the fabric of everyday life, one question hung in the air, like a challenge to the future. Can character, not charisma, redefine leadership for the generations to come? The East Room never stopped replaying. On televisions, phones, and tablets, the moment looped endlessly, Trump shouting, Obama standing still. But over time, the fury blurred while the calm grew sharper. People no longer watched for the chaos. They watched for the composure, the steadiness that turned silence into a weapon. The replay wasn't remembered as one man beating another, but as principle triumphing over noise. Communities stitched the scene into memory like folklore. Teachers quoted it in classrooms. Pastors echoed it in sermons, and families repeated it at their dinner tables. Each time the words returned, the same line rang louder than the shouts that had once tried to drown it. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. The phrase became less a response to rage and more a truth carved into the bedrock of civic life. The emotional beat was closure, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of steadiness, a lesson pressed into the heart of a country that had watched dignity stand its ground. The footage slowed with each replay, the contrast made even starker by silence. Obama's calm had become more than a moment. It had become a victory no poll or headline could measure. And as the story settled into history, one question lingered, like an echo in every hall, every classroom, every home. Do we measure leaders by their power or by the lessons they leave behind? The moment no longer belonged to Washington. It belonged to the people who carried it forward. Parents told the story to their children at dinner tables, replaying the clip on small screens, their voices soft but firm. This is what dignity looks like. Teachers scrawled the words across chalkboards in looping letters, reminding students that leadership was not the loudest voice, but the clearest truth. Pastors lifted the phrase into sermons, their congregations whispering amen, as if it had always been scripture. Ordinary lives became the keepers of the memory. In union halls, workers passed around printouts of the quote, tucking them into wallets like talismans. In classrooms, debates erupted over what it meant to lead with character instead of noise. Families hung posters with the line above kitchen tables, each glance a reminder that respect could not be ordered, only earned. The memory endured not through monuments or legislation, but through repetition in the everyday. The emotional beat swelled as the moment transformed into folklore. It was no longer just a clash under chandeliers. It was a moral turning point carried on the lips of millions. A single night replayed endlessly had become a compass for the future. Obama's calm was remembered not as one man's triumph over another, but as a lesson etched into the conscience of a generation. And as that story passed from parents to children, from classrooms to pulpits, one question lingered like a torch handed forward. What moments in your life will your children remember about you? That night, America faced a mirror it could not turn away from. On one side stood a man shouting until his voice broke, pacing the marble floor, like a storm contained in a single body. On the other stood a man who did not move, who let silence wrap itself around him until it became something sharper than rage. The cameras caught the contrast, but it was the people who carried the weight of what they had seen. The image replayed endlessly, yet it never dulled. Trump's fury looked smaller each time, his voice hoarse, his face twisted with desperation. Obama's composure grew larger with each replay, his stillness filling the silence, his words echoing like a drumbeat across the nation. Rage had been loud, but dignity had been unforgettable. In that clash, America saw more than politics, it saw itself. It saw the way anger can demand attention, but never respect the way calm can look fragile until it shatters the illusion of power. Families, teachers, pastors, and workers didn't just remember the night as news, they remembered it as revelation. For once, truth had not shouted. It had waited steady until the nation leaned forward to hear. The emotional closure built slowly like a tide withdrawing after a storm. Applause had erupted in the East Room, shaking chandeliers and rattling glasses. But even that thunder faded. What lingered in the silence after was not noise, not spectacle, but a lesson. A reminder that leadership is not volume, not fury, but the ability to hold steady when everything around you demands collapse. The climax of that memory was not in the clash itself, but in its aftermath. Silence turned into applause, applause into stillness, and stillness into something deeper. An understanding that character once revealed cannot be unseen. The country had watched a president demand control and fail, and a former president stand quietly and prevail. The lesson etched itself into history not with a shout, but with restraint. Communities felt it. In classrooms, the clip was dissected like scripture students, debating not who won, but what the night meant. In homes, parents told their children, "This is what strength looks like." In churches, pastors wove the words into sermons not as political commentary, but as timeless truth. A single sentence. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned outlived the chaos that birthed it. The night became less about the men and more about the mirror they held up to the nation. Americans saw themselves in the choice between fury and dignity, between volume and vision. It was not simply a confrontation under chandeliers, it was a question whispered into the marrow of a democracy. What kind of leadership do we honor? What kind of voice do we trust? As history marched forward, the clip remained not as scandal, but as parable. Each replay stripped away the noise until only the truth was left. It was never about who shouted loudest, it was about who stood tallest when the shouting stopped. That night had shown the country that chaos burns hot but fast while dignity endures like stone. And as the replay finally slowed, fading from fury to applause, from applause to silence, only the question remained sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore when the next storm comes. Will we reward the loudest voice or the truest one? What America witnessed that night was more than a clash of two men. It was a timeless reminder of what true leadership looks like. One man shouted until his voice cracked, but in the end it was the one who stood calm, who spoke few words with steady conviction that people remembered. It showed us all that dignity, patience, and restraint carry a strength that outlasts fury. For those of us who have lived through decades of history, the marches of the 60s, the struggles of the 70s, the crises and recoveries of later years, this moment feels familiar. We've seen tempers flare, leaders stumble, and voices try to drown out truth. But we've also seen that character endures. Just as past generations passed down lessons of resilience and integrity, this moment hands us the same charge to model dignity, even when chaos surrounds us. In our own lives, we may not stand at podiums or face cameras, but we face storms all the same. Arguments at home, disagreements at work, conflicts in our communities. Each one is a chance to choose between shouting or listening, between noise or truth. The lesson is clear when we choose calm over rage, dignity over pride. We teach those around us, especially our children and grandchildren, that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. The true victory of that night wasn't political, it was human. It reminded us that leadership is not about volume, but about vision, not about domination, but about steadiness. In your next moment of conflict, whether at the dinner table in your community or even in quiet conversation, will you choose to prove your point with noise or with the strength of calm dignity? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.